Welcome, future YouTube viewers. Starting off with some Trump assault on civil rights. The Trump administration is rolling back women's rights by 50 years by changing definitions of domestic violence and sexual assault. Donald Trump's decision to change definitions of domestic violence and sexual assault has rolled back women's rights by half a century, campaigners have warned. The Trump administration quietly changed the definition of both domestic violence and sexual assault back in April, but the move has only just surfaced. The change could have significant repercussions for millions of victims of gender-based violence. The Trump Justice Department's definition only considers physical harm that constitutes a felony or misdemeanor to be domestic violence, meaning other forms of domestic violence, such as psychological abuse, coercive control, and manipulation, no longer fall under the department's definition. Under the Obama administration, the definition was drastically more expansive and was assessed by domestic violence organizations. Of course. So, big change here. Domestic abusers no longer are guilty of abuse if they don't touch their victim. If all they do is, gaslight them, belittle them, denigrate them, tell them they're stupid or ugly or worthless, all these sorts of tactics that abusers use that never cause a physical harm, they're no longer abusers, according to the Trump Justice Department. And this is an important distinction. Whatever you want to say about Obama, and I have a lot to say about Obama. He was not a good person. He did a lot of bad things in the country. But at least Obama listened to experts. He would bring in experts. He would talk to them. He would listen to them, most importantly, and make sure that whatever action he took was appropriate for whatever event he was dealing with. This is why the H1N1 and Ebola outbreaks weren't that bad under Obama, and we're dealing with COVID as poorly as we're dealing with it now. The Office on Violence Against Women, part of the Department of Justice, has amended its definition of sexual assault to also focus on criminal justice aspects. Holly Taylor Dunn, a senior lecturer at the University of Worcester, who has been working in the field of domestic and sexual violence for 17 years, said she was shocked by the move. The academic, who has worked in frontline roles in the domestic violence sector and used to be a domestic abuse officer, for the police, argued the Trump administration's decision turned the clock back 50 years. I was massively surprised and really shocked, she said. It is quite scary how quietly it has happened. It is a massive step backwards. We have literally gone back to the 70s. We have worked so hard since the 60s and 70s to get domestic abuse and sexual violence understood as being about more than physical violence. Changing the definition to take it back to being about physical harm completely undermines what domestic abuse is about. Exactly. From my understanding, physical abuse is essentially a last resort of abusers, because it's much more difficult to hide physical abuse. I mean, that's the classic trope, right? A guy is abusing his woman or his girlfriend, his wife, whatever. And obviously the trope is pretty much about a guy abusing a man, but there are women who abuse people, particularly mothers. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy, or not dichotomy, but an interesting situation where men abuse their spouses and women tend to abuse their children. But, I mean, obviously, not all women abuse their children, not all men abuse their partners, but this just seems to be how it generally works out. So, the fact that the Trump White House, the Justice Department, has defined domestic violence as being exclusively about physical violence necessitating a felony or a misdemeanor means that there's a lot of abusers who are going to get away with everything. Narrowing the definition will stop victims being able to access the services they need. Prosecutions for domestic and sexual violence will also fall because they are limiting it to the most severe forms of abuse, so fewer victims are likely to come forward and seek help. So yeah, like I was starting to say up here, the classic trope about an abuser getting caught is someone shows up with, like they're wearing big dark sunglasses, or they've got a scarf on, or some odd article of clothing, and they have to take it off because someone, well-meaning forces them to, and they've got a big black eye or a handprint around their throat or some other form of, some other visible sign of physical abuse. And that's how an abuser gets caught. The problem is that a lot of times, by the time you get to that point, there's been months, if not years, of mental and emotional abuse, and they just decided to step it up for one reason or another. So by doing this, you're giving a lot of abusers way more power, because now the abusers are able to say, nothing I'm doing is illegal. I'm not laying a hand on you, so I'm not abusing you. Narrowing the definition will stop victims being able to access the services they need. Prosecutions for domestic and sexual violence will also fall because they are limiting it to the most severe forms of abuse, so fewer victims are likely to come forward and seek help. The move sets a bad example. People look to America and the UK to be progressive on issues such as these. If America does it, then other countries could quite conceivably think it is an appropriate response. Ms. Taylor Dunn, who leads a master's degree in understanding domestic and sexual violence, argued it was unlikely for the UK government to follow America's lead and introduce such a measure. Controlling coercive behavior in intimate and familial relationships became a new offense in the UK, punishable with a maximum prison sentence of 5 years under the 2015 Serious Crime Act. The academic said both research and victims prove that the problem is not about physical violence at its core, but noted it had been a slow process getting this form of abuse criminalized here in Britain. Ms. Taylor Dunn said the domestic violence sector had strived to raise awareness of how complex the issue is. She argued survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence are already treated badly by the criminal justice system due to deeply ingrained sexist stereotypes of women, and the White House would only feed existing stereotypes. Right. By essentially saying that domestic violence is only when you are physically harmed, when you get slapped or you get punched or they grab your arm too hard, they jerk you around like that, whatever violence that constitutes a felony or misdemeanor, if that is the only definition of domestic violence, then it completely undermines women who say, I had to leave him, he was such an abusive asshole. Well, what did he do? He'd go out drinking and then tell me that he was home by 10 when he didn't get in till 1, or he would constantly call me fat and stupid even when I hadn't done anything, or all kinds of legitimate abuse, but there's no physical scars. And now under the Trump Justice Department, those aren't abuse, at least legally speaking. So now they get labeled as whiners or people who just can't take a joke because they don't want to be fucking abused. Suzanne Jacob of UK domestic violence charity Safe Lives said, these changes are a huge step backwards that will have very real consequences for victims and survivors of domestic abuse in the States. Wherever you live, if you've experienced domestic abuse or listened to those who have, you know all too well that physical violence is never the whole picture, and many survivors tell us that the emotional and psychological abuse takes much longer to recover from. Closer to home, with the publication this week of the draft domestic abuse bill, this is a timely reminder that the new statutory definition of domestic abuse must encompass the different forms it can take. This is obviously talking about the UK here. Women's Aid identified domestic abuse as a gendered crime, saying that while both men and women may experience incidents of interpersonal violence and abuse, women are considerably more likely to experience repeated and severe forms of abuse, including sexual violence. Again, this is true. Not all men are abusers, but most men are abusers. Or most abusers are men. Most abusers are men. There are women abusers, but most abusers are men. The Trump administration's new definition says the term sexual assault means any non-consensual sexual act prescribed by federal, tribal, or state law, including when the victim lacks capacity to consent. I'm honestly shocked about that last part. In contrast, the previous definition was more expansive, saying sexual assault is any type of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. Falling under the definition of sexual assault are sexual activities as forced sexual intercourse, forcible sodomy, child molestation, incest, fondling, and attempted rape. The Trump government's amendments to the definitions were first written about by Natalie Nanasi, director of the Judge Elmo B. Hunter Legal Center for Victims of Crimes Against Women at Southern Methodist University Dedman School of Law. What is clear is that these seemingly semantic changes, even if not yet embodied in official law or policy, are part of a broader trend toward the devaluation of women by this administration and this president. She said the new terms may mean the OVW restricts grants for community efforts to combat domestic and sexual abuse to agencies that serve victims of crime, meaning many survivors could be left without resources. OVW may also change its education and training resources to include the new definition, no longer considering some abuse survivors as victims. Could you imagine that? Going to someone for help and getting help, and then they change the definition and you're no longer an abuse victim. I mean, you still definitely are, but legally, definitionally, you're not. Some 43.5 million women have experienced psychological aggression from an intimate partner in the U.S., according to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. More than half of women murdered each year in the U.S. are killed by an intimate partner. Yeah, it's a real problem, and this is going to make it worse. And just because Trump is a total dirtbag, total shitbag, Trump administration moves to allow doctors to refuse trans patients as COVID rages. This new rule would roll back Obama-era protections that ban discrimination against transgender people at the worst time possible. This is less than a week old. This is some fresh news here. Not good news, though. As the U.S. passes 50,000 deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic, the Trump administration quietly moved forward with a rule that would make it easier for doctors to refuse to treat transgender patients. Politico reports that a new Department of Health and Human Services rule that would remove Obama-era transgender protections was circulated around the Department of Justice yesterday, one of the final steps before publicly releasing the rule. The White House also updated a website to say that the Obama rule is under review. At issue is Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. The rule bans discrimination on the basis of sex in healthcare, which the Obama administration interpreted as banning discrimination against transgender people, since discriminating against someone because their gender identity doesn't align with their sex assigned at birth is effectively discriminating against them because of sex. Okay. This is obviously something written as more of a milquetoast centrist definition, but you know what, I'll take it. If there's an official rule stating that transgender people are not allowed to be discriminated because they're transgender, you know, the outcomes is good. The Trump administration has consistently said that protections on the basis of sex do not apply to anti-transgender discrimination, and HHS, which has been working on the new rule for over a year, said that the rule change would make its regulations more consistent. So this is Trump not liking trans people for some reason. I don't know, trans people are fucking great. Trans rights. LGBTQ equality advocates said that the change would allow hospitals and healthcare workers to discriminate legally. Gotta love legal discrimination. If the final rule is anything like the proposed rule, HHS is adopting changes that would be harmful in the best of times, but that are especially cruel in the midst of a global pandemic that is disproportionately affecting vulnerable communities and exacerbating disparities. Yeah, trans people are much more likely to not have the kind of support necessary to survive something like a pandemic. They're much more likely to have a more precarious job situation. Even when we ignore the pandemic, they're much less likely to have friends and family who are supportive of them. I mean, I would argue that trans people probably have some of the most ride or die family and friends around if they have supportive friends and family. But statistically speaking, they don't have that kind of support structure, unfortunately. This is also why the suicide rate, or attempted suicide rate among trans people is so high, because if they don't have the right support structure around them, it can be really difficult. Discrimination against transgender people is rampant in healthcare, right? There's a lot of older people in healthcare who think that they know best about people and haven't learned the latest in gender theory and the stuff about transgender people, excuse me. The Center for American Progress, CAP is Neera Tanden's organization, and Neera Tanden is something of a shitlib, borderline fascist in some ways. Found that 29% of transgender adults, but they are liberal, so they do support trans rights. So, you know, pick your battles. Said that a healthcare professional refused to see them because of their gender identity. And I don't know if this is their worry that so this could be anything from the doctor is worried that there's going to be something weird about the trans person they're not going to be able to deal with, or they just don't want to validate the transgender person's gender identity. LGBTQ people are 7 times more likely to say they have avoided going to the doctor out of fear of discrimination, a phenomenon that advocates warn could be deadly during the coronavirus pandemic. Yeah, and I mean, this is on top of the people who are afraid to go to the doctor because they can't afford it. Because either they have shitty insurance, and even if they go, they're going to have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars, or because they don't have any insurance, and if they go, they're going to have to pay thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So, yeah, especially during coronavirus, this is a really bad situation. I'm really scared about what that means for testing, for treatment, for people's comfort-seeking care, said Sharita Gruberg, who works on LGBTQ issues for CAP. This is not the time we want people to avoid seeking care and treatment. An HHS spokesperson said, "We do not comment on the rulemaking process," and referred questions to the HHS Office of Civil Rights, which is run by Roger Severino, a former Heritage Foundation staffer who has a long history of anti-LGBTQ activism and was called the most dangerous person to head up the Office of Civil Rights at HHS by HRC when he was appointed in 2017. I mean, when the shittiest person you know is right? As we have shown in our recent efforts to protect persons from disability and age discrimination during the pandemic, HHS will vigorously enforce civil rights laws as passed by Congress before, during, and after any rulemaking. Since conservatives believe that discrimination on the basis of sex is entirely separate from discrimination against transgender people, his statement does not contradict the possible new rule from his perspective. Hoo boy! Yeah, they're right there. Transgender people are, according to conservatives, there's no contradiction in saying that you can't discriminate someone based on sex, but you also can discriminate someone if they are transgender. That's perfectly consistent in their view and bullshit in anyone else's view. So yeah, this is what we're talking about when we say we need to get Trump out. We need to get someone who isn't Trump, preferably a Democrat. I mean, obviously, we all prefer Bernie. But the odds of us getting to Milwaukee and the DNC deciding, you know what, we spend $1 billion and a ton of goodwill and political capital to stop you during the primary, but we all had a change of heart and we actually support you now, Bernie, so we're going to put our weight behind you. You're going to be the nominee. I mean, that could happen. Stranger things have happened, but it's not going to happen. This is why we need to vote for Biden if he's the nominee. And I know there's a town hall going on with him in HRC right now. I couldn't care less. He didn't announce her as his VP at the start. It's unlikely that they would delay that or whatever. So this is why we need to get Trump out of office. As bad as Biden is, and I totally agree, Biden is shit. He's not Donald Trump. He's not a Republican conservative. He's a conservative Democrat. But he's not a Republican conservative, which means that the Democratic line is that transgender people are valid. That's been their line since 2012. And while they've shown a propensity to want to shoot themselves in the foot, I don't think they're going to walk that back, especially if it helps them win against Trump, assuming they want to win. So everyone who tries to say, all the trans people on Twitter I see who are like, I can't vote for Biden, he's a rapist. He's horrible, he's the same as Trump. Read this article again and tell me that. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked it, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you. See you next time.